Great horned owls are one of the earliest birds we get. They start their breeding process and their courting in December, so they can have eggs in January. We occasionally can get them in late February, but most of the time we're getting them in March, and then also in April and May even. The one that we had recently, that was about a week old when we got him, he came from a bit north of Woodland on Road 17. He fell out of a nest that was in a riding arena, and it was felt that his parents left the nest at that time. He had maggots in his ears, which is something that we do see occasionally with these guys. And so he's taken to the hospital and the maggots were removed. We kept him on medication, antibiotics, for a few days, the few days that we had him. And during that time we had to hand feed him 4 times a day, and he had his eyes closed at that point. When we put him back in a nest, a wild nest, he was about 9 days old or so, almost 10. His eyes were just starting to open. And so it's critical that we get him back around his own kind before he sees us and imprints on us, which would be an irreversible behavior. And he wouldn't really identify with his own species at that point, and he would in some cases be potentially aggressive to people, so he would not be a releasable bird if he was imprinted on people. We transferred him to Lindsay Museum in Walnut Creek because they had a bird that was the same age as him, and it's very much better to raise them with other babies so that they can see each other. That helps them at least have something else to imprint upon. But in addition to having another baby, they knew where that one came from, and it was in a nest that had been damaged, and there was another sibling still remaining in what was left of that nest, and the parents were still tending to it. So when I contacted them, they were in the process of arranging to have a tree climber bring the baby back to that original nest. And what they did to mitigate the problems with the original nest is they brought a basket of the appropriate size, and they climbed the tree, took our baby and the one that came from the nest, put it back on site in the basket with the third sibling, and now the 2 great horned owls have a nest with 3 babies instead of 2, which they'll usually do quite well with. If you can't put them back in a nest, then you have to raise them by hand. And in order to do that and avoid imprinting on people, then you hopefully don't have just one bird by itself, but if you do, then what you'll have to do is cover yourself up with some kind of barrier, like a blanket that goes over you, or work from behind a wall of some kind of cloth or whatever so the bird can't see you at all. And then you use a puppet that is shaped and colored like in this case, an adult great horned owl. And you feed the bird so that it doesn't have any visual contact with you. It can see the puppet, and that's all it sees. And then as soon as you can get it to be self-feeding, and it can handle the temperatures of the outdoors, that's when we would put it in with one of our wild birds so that it has that visual model. Whether or not that bird will feed the baby, at least it has something to look at that is appropriate species, and that way it'll imprint on that bird instead of us. We have a great horned owl that we call Puffy here, and he is the one that we use for fostering chicks. He doesn't really feed them per se, but he's very gentle with them and doesn't really seem concerned about their presence. So we put them in at the appropriate age. When they can go outside in his cage and they can thermoregulate well and they're eating on their own, then we will put him in with Puffy, and he will sit next to them, and they'll see him, they'll hear him clacking his beak, and they'll imprint on him instead of us. So it's critical when we get a little one like this little week-old baby that we try to get him to that stage where he can go outside without having visual contact with us. If we can do that and then put him in as a self-feeder with Puffy, then he'll have a pretty good chance of imprinting on great horned owl instead of a person. So once they're in with Puffy, we're going to keep them in there till they're probably around 6 weeks old, and that would be the typical age that they will come out of a nest and be seen on branches or on the ground. 5 to 6 weeks is when they would come out of the nest on their own in the wild. they're not really going to fly well till 9 or 10 weeks. So great horned owls do spend a good 3 weeks on the ground often, with their parents still tending to them. When they get about here probably 6 to 7 weeks old, we're going to take them from Puffy's cage and put a band on them, federal band, so that if they're ever found again by somebody after we release them, that we can get some information as to the details of that finding. And they're put off-site at a very large cage that one of our volunteers has, and they're raised together in this cage, and it's called a hack site or a soft release, where after a couple of months in that cage, she will then open the door and the birds are free to leave. But hopefully what they've done in those couple of months is they've learned how to fly, but they've also built a fidelity to that site, and that should keep them coming back to that cage site whenever they get hungry. Because great horned owls are not going to know how to hunt on their own. They are going to have the physical abilities to do it, but they rely on their parents to support them as they become very skilled hunters. Great horned owls also stay with their parents for an extended period of time relative to most raptors. They're not even going to leave their parents' territory most of the time till fall of the year. So with these birds, it's critical that they have this soft release, which means that we provide them a food backup while they're acquiring their hunting skills. So once they leave that cage, food will be provided on top of the cage for them, and for several months they have the option of coming back to the cage whenever they're hungry. What will happen is, as they become more proficient in catching their own food, they become less dependent on that food support at the cage site. Eventually, they will be independent enough that they won't come back at all and they'll be on their own.